My pleasure. It's my pleasure to welcome Fadi this evening. And many of us have met you before because you came to one of our annual conferences a few years ago with Marianne, your wife. And I will always remember that, and will always remember the exhibition we had with some of your work. I should say that Fadi is quite a well-known iconographer and also a painter. Some of us, those of us who go to the trustee meetings, have been to Stevenage, to the Coptic Centre there, and we were shown round all over the place to classrooms and a gymnasium. But the highlight of our visit was the visit to the cathedral, the Coptic Cathedral in Stevenage, which is an absolutely wonderful place. And it is full of Fadi's work, full of beautiful, stunning icons, which are truly transportative. They take you beyond yourself. I think we'll learn more about that. But I experienced that on our visit to Stevenage. So thank you so much for being with us. The other thank you, of course, I have is for all the kindness you've shown and generosity in giving us a Christmas card every year for many years now. And that includes this year. And when you get your mailing, which will be quite soon, I think in a few days now, you will see the new Christmas card order form, and on it will be one of Fadi's icons. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm trying to actually look around and see who I might not have met. I know I've obviously met Bob before, and I've met yourself. Matt, have we met before? We have?
We have, and I remember you're a beautiful singer too.
Wow. When did you sample that?
That must be years ago at Christians Aware conference.
Wow. I'm not a beautiful singer anymore. But thank you. I'm not sure if I've met George or Pamela or Kathleen, but very nice to meet you today. Very nice to meet you today. Thank you for having me. I am not a great speaker, sadly, but I will do my best not to waste your time, because there's nothing worse than a waste of time, is there? I've been asked by Barbara today to try and just give an introduction into the title of Icons and the Christian Faith. It's a very broad title. Hopefully I've honed in on something which I find useful, and one of the main reasons that I entered iconography in the first instance. For those of you who don't know what I do, in a second I'll just share my screen, and you'll just have a minute or two just to watch a kind of making of or process video showing what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just see if I can just start sharing the screen now successfully, and if all goes well, so far so good. Can everyone see that? Yes. Great. All right, wonderful. In that case, Icons and the Christian Faith, as I said, is the title. And on this slide, I'll just start playing. I'll see if I can mute it, because I don't think you'll hear it successfully, but a video just showing, again, what I do on a day-to-day basis. As Barbara said, I work as an iconographer, which basically means I work as an artist almost entirely dedicated to the work of making icons for churches and cathedrals and people's homes. So not just dedicated entirely to large buildings, but sometimes very small buildings, people's homes. And I never thought I would ever do this. My father, who was a doctor, was also a very, very talented hobbyist artist who did iconography as well. He did a lot of things, actually. He did model airplanes as well. And when I used to watch him as a child, I thought, oh gosh, I never want to try that. That looks so boring. It looks so finicky, and all these tiny little brushes and tiny tools. That's not what I want to do, because I used to love using thick oil paint. I don't know if there are any painters amongst us or anyone who's tried anything particularly messy in an art craft, but the enjoyment of the material itself is wonderful. in painting. And so I thought, I never want to try iconography. That looks incredibly boring. And so most of the work that I was doing before I did iconography was large, thick oil paintings, and the subject matter was mostly English literature, mostly, in fact, children's literature, things like Narnia, things like Alice in Wonderland, anything fictional and fantasy I loved. But about 18, I decided that I really somehow want to try and reconcile my faith, which was a bit stronger then, thank God. I did grow up with Christian parents, but I think around 16 I dwindled quite a bit, and by 18 I was back on track. And I just thought, how do I reconcile my faith with my love of painting? The obvious was iconography in our culture, the Coptic Orthodox culture, because it was so prevalent in our life and around our home. There were plenty of icons. So I decided to go and do a very short apprenticeship with an iconographer who'd been around for a long time. He was actually 80 at the time, doing what would be his last church in LA. So I went there and watched him. And honestly, he just said, sit down and watch for a month. Don't touch a paintbrush except to clean my palette. So I watched for a whole month, and it transformed me, because I could see that it wasn't for him just about the subject matter. It was for him also about the materials, and he enjoyed the materials just as much as he did the subject matter. And the two together combined, for me, suddenly made sense, resonated with me, and I said, yeah, that is for me. I think I can go there, Jesus. I think you could probably hold my hand and we could do this. And actually, my father always told me, this is a bad idea. I think you've heard wrong. I don't think you've heard Jesus's voice very well here. I think you're going off your own steam. I think you want to be an iconographer. I don't know if God wants you to be. And it wasn't until about 5 years before he passed away, which was about 3 years ago, he said, okay, maybe I was wrong, maybe. So it was good to hear. Right, well, that's enough about me. Just a little brief intro. For those of you who've never sort of understood what an icon is, because it's quite a mysterious thing that you can walk into if you don't frequently see them, depending on which denomination you are. It's not always frequent that you'll come across an icon. I can see them in Lutheran churches now, and certainly the Orthodox churches and Catholic, of course, have a particular style that they adopt. But the funny thing is, actually, icons, as it were, they have their first examples even during Jesus's life. For those of you who've ever heard a kind of quick history of iconography, you'll be aware that Saint Luke has been said to have painted perhaps some of the first icons of Jesus being held by his mother Mary as a child. And of course, you know, Luke knew Jesus mostly as an adult. So the thought that he would premeditate, or rather meditate on something that had come before Jesus's adulthood, meant that icons in their usefulness, in their kind of meditative quality, had already begun. It wasn't just about portraying what people saw, but what people understood about what they saw, and the relevance of who they saw and what they understood of him. Some of the other famous icons, of course, depending on whether you believe in the genuineness of them, the Shroud of Turin, which, if it's to be believed, was made by Jesus himself. There was also the Veil of Veronica, which is another like the Shroud of Turin, which is we don't actually have the original anymore, but it's said to have had an imprint of Christ's face on the road to the cross. When Veronica pressed it against his face, his facial imprint was there. There's also something called the Shroud or the Cloth of Edessa. There was a very sick king who sent for Jesus during his lifetime, saying, I know that you go around healing people. I have an illness. It was most likely leprosy. I have an illness. Would you come and heal me? And Jesus said, I can't, but I'm going to send one of my disciples or my envoys to you. And actually, the king beat him to it. He sent an envoy to Jesus, and Jesus sent him back a cloth with an imprinted image of his face. And that's, funnily enough, documented by a historian, Eusebius. And the most important thing about Eusebius noting it down is that even though he was a Christian, he completely disagreed with the use of iconography. So for him to have noted it as a historical artifact or historical truth was very, very interesting and certainly believable. Right, to the talk. I think before I start, actually, could I trouble everyone to tell me if they have any particular questions that they had brought to the meeting about icons or iconography, so that I make sure I can answer it while I go along. If you don't, and you just generate questions as you go along, that's fine. But if you have any questions now, would you mind sharing them with me? And if there's nothing for a minute, I'll just carry on.
May I just ask one?
Yes, please.
I'm sure you will be telling us about all the materials that you use, because I know you use eggs quite a lot.
Yes. Okay. Yes, we will cover the materials, so that'll be covered.
I'm sure you will. Yes, thank you very much.
No, thank you for mentioning it, because it almost didn't make it into the presentation. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions that I can keep in the back of my mind?
I was just intrigued. You mentioned Lutheran churches having icons, so if you can expand later a bit more on that, please.
Sure. Actually, I think I'll just answer that question quickly. When I say Lutheran churches in a kind of a broad sense, truthfully, I've been to 3 Lutheran churches, and 2 of them had commissioned work from me as altarpieces. So I'm saying I know of Lutheran churches that do have icons in them, but I was told by their pastors there that they do in fact have other sister churches around the world, perhaps satellite churches from their own church, who do endorse or who do support the use of icons in their own churches, and that Luther himself didn't prohibit the use of icons. So it seems to become a wider spread usage in the last 10-20 years. That's, I'm afraid, all I know of that. Yes, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Eleanor, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Yes, so for my job, I run a breastfeeding support project, and I love breastfeeding and art. I wondered if there was any like icons which featured breastfeeding or mothering in any particular way, which you might be able to tell us about.
Yes, I'll answer that quickly, actually. In fact, one of the most important and historical icons in the Coptic Church is what we term Maria Lactans, which of course I think is the Latin for breastfeeding mother Mary, and it follows almost in parallel what the ancient Egyptians used to use as an image of Isis and Horus, and she was breastfeeding him. So yes, breastfeeding icons are pretty prevalent, especially in the Coptic tradition. Less so in the Byzantine, Greek, and Russian tradition, but certainly in the Coptic tradition, it's quite prevalent and carries a very, very obvious and deep message to it. All right, well, I'll keep those in mind as well and see if I can make them any more relevant in the meeting. So I've started the first slide. Since this is a talk about icons in the Christian faith, I have to admit, I thought it would best to start by being very obvious and defining, at least for me, what is the simple message of the Christian faith. Because especially in my recent years, I found when I have 2 children, one is 5 and one is about 1.5 years, and life right now is extremely chaotic. I know that plenty of you will have had children, and you know the chaos that I'm talking about, and I bow at your expertise for the years that you've had of children. Because I'm finding it extremely chaotic to be a father, to be a husband, to be a servant of any kind at church, and to find any time to pray except with my kids at their bedtime. So I'm finding Christian life quite chaotic, if I might say, and I've been struggling to try and keep it, if I can, to the most simple kind of core of what I'm meant to do, and the question of what does God want of me has come up plenty. Of course, my dad used to correct me and say, God doesn't want anything of you, he wants for you. But still the question rolls around in my mind. What is the minimum that I can achieve to call myself a good follower of Jesus? Is there such a thing as being a simple follower of Jesus, at least right now, while life is chaotic? And I came to these sort of, these verses. I'm just going to move this over here. These verses, Paul says to the Thessalonians, we urge you, brothers and sisters, to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. And again, if I go to the next point, Jesus himself told the Pharisees, when they asked him, teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? We're all very familiar with this. Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like to it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these commandments. And just one more, which has always interested me. St. James to his readers says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Although there are many, many verses, I'm sure, where we can probably reel them off, those who are particularly well read. Those three come to mind when I think about what is it to be a sort of core Christian, what is at the core of Christian life. And this is one that is often quoted in the Orthodox Church because we love St. Athanasius so much, clearly because he came from Alexandria in Egypt. For the Son of God became man so that we might become God. That one's very, very powerful and has a very large following and is usually termed by the title divinization or theosis, us becoming more and more like God, effectively divinized over our lifetime. So I've kind of put it down to this, for myself at the very least. To be a Christian is simply this, in my understanding, to become more and more like Jesus daily, to love and worship God with all that we are, and to act out our faith by loving our neighbors, and especially those in distress, as we do ourselves. For me, those three, if I can just manage to touch on these three daily, I'm a happy man. Do I? I don't, but I'd be a happy man if I did. So the question therefore being, in my capacity as an iconographer today, how do icons help us in changing our love towards neighbors? Because that is ultimately why I do what I do. I don't just try to make pretty images. I pray and I hope that what I do spurs on some action, because without action, we are just, we're just all this, aren't we? We're just all talk, and all talk is nothing, is it? So what does it do? So the principal role of icons is thus. Number one, the icon tries to engage our senses to see and therefore remember that God and his kingdom are always present. He is here in this very room. And I'll expand on that shortly. Number two, icons try to encourage us, when we see the icons, to close our eyes and speak to him. And that is obviously the most important one to me. Even though I've put it as number two, I put that as number two, but I do think that's the most important. If an icon doesn't spur you to prayer, in my opinion, it's actually failed. It should encourage your heart, whether silently, whether visibly, to spur you to some kind of connection. Number three, to see the world and his children as he sees them, i.e. to have the eyes of God. Now, what I mean by this, I'll get into very shortly, but ultimately, to look at an icon is to try and see what God sees. That's why they're quite often termed very poetically as windows to heaven, because we're effectively trying to give you an image of what we, the church, believe is there, but sometimes understand that with our human eyes, we can't see. There are many things we believe are there, but we can't see. And I'll just expand on that shortly. But let's go through those points and see what exactly I mean. Number one, to engage our senses and to see and remember. What do I mean by that? I can see actually in where you all are, one or two of you are in your home offices, and I personally have quite a few family photos in my office. And in our offices, I think those photos, and remember that the word icon is literally the Greek word for image. So those icons of our loved ones help us to remember them and keep them in our thoughts and prayers. I don't think any of us can deny that fact. That's why we usually put photos around our house, so that they bring to our memory in an instant those people who we'd like to continue to remember. So icons in a church are intended to do the same thing. They try to surround us with the visual reminder that we are surrounded by, as St. Paul says, such a great cloud of witnesses, those who have come before us and passed and are now in paradise, so that our minds and our hearts and our spirits never forget them. That is an incredibly important function of an icon. It's a visual reminder of what we believe is there, but we cannot see with our human eyes. So point number two, to close our eyes and speak to him. What do you, I'll ask you all, what do you do when you see the photos of those loved ones in your offices or hanging on your walls around your house, especially those who have passed on? We often close our eyes and think of them. Like I said, my parents actually passed away 3 years ago, within the same month, in fact, not of COVID. But it was a very powerful time for me, and I suddenly filled my house with plenty of photos of them, so that I could continually be reminding myself, these people, yes, I can't see them with my human eyes, but I do believe, as the church teaches us, they are alive, they are resurrected, they are with the Lord. And I want to continually remind myself that they are with me, that they are with him, and I can talk to them and I can engage with them. Yes, they may not talk back in an audible way, but I do believe I can converse with them. So that's the reason why we put images around our house. Icons are no different. They're meant to be the same. They're meant to encourage us to speak to everyone we see in an icon. They are visual reminders of the people who we hold dear in the heavenly kingdom, in paradise. Jesus himself, maybe Mary, maybe our favorite saint, St. Francis, maybe St. Barbara, all these people who came before us, who are incredibly inspiring people, even 20th century saints, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them, not necessarily painted already, but they are effectively just visual reminders of the people we believe are alive just in the heavenly kingdom now. I'll just share actually a few stories. If I go back a couple of slides, in fact, this image that you see here, this is a chapel that I just completed with some friends in Los Angeles. And as we were staying at one of the parishioners' houses, he would tell us stories about someone who had just passed away from their parish, an elderly lady. I can't actually remember her name, but he would tell us that they would be sitting in parish meetings, just the parish council of 10 or 20 people or so. And all of a sudden, the room would completely fill with incense smoke. And, the priest would say, who on earth lit an incense burner in here? We're having a meeting. And everyone would say, not me. I didn't do it. And they would all turn to this lady who they knew had stories like this. And they would say, did you? And she said, no. But if you look up, and she would look up and she would say, can you not see them? And she said she would see dozens of angels flying around the room saying with their eyes, we are with you. We're here also. This meeting isn't just about you, and you're not alone. And there were dozens of stories where she would be sitting in the middle of the church, and everyone would be sat down. And all of a sudden, she would stand up and gaze up to the heavens. And they would say, what can you see? And they would keep looking at her, and they would find oil dripping from her forehead, very fragrant oil, they said. And in the Coptic church, that is frequently used as a reminder of the kind of anointing that King David had. And they would say, what can you see? And she said, they're everywhere. Angels are everywhere. The saints are everywhere. They're here in this place. And so this just reminds us that every now and again, we're given the opportunity to just see with our spiritual eyes, and not just with our human eyes, that there is a reality around us of the kingdom of heaven that is not so far away. In fact, it can be extremely close. So I'm going to go to the next point. Number 3, how can icons change our love towards neighbors? Number 3 is to see the world and his children as he sees them. And what I mean is to see with the eyes of God. So we know that God is omniscient. It's a belief we all have in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church and all churches in the Christian denominations. God is everywhere, and he is able to do everything all the time in any way. And so time does not restrict his knowledge, nor do anything that's hidden to our own human eyes. God sees everything that we can't see. You obviously know this icon, and if you don't, I'll explain. This is the icon of the Transfiguration, which is extremely important in the field of iconography, because this point that I'm trying to mention about seeing as he sees is very well represented in icons of the Incarnation. If we just remind ourselves of the story, it's said that he took Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and all of a sudden he was transfigured, and they saw him shining with light. But of course, in the Christian church, we understand that God is the same forever, today and tomorrow. he didn't change. Jesus was always the radiant Jesus. So what did change? It was the sight of the disciples. In a way, their eyes were the ones that were transfigured in that moment, and they were able to see as God sees. And there's a wonderful story about this, and you have to forgive me that it is again from the story from the Coptic perspective, just because that's where I grew up, so that's where I get all my stories from. But my father was a very, very close friend of the head deacon, who was head deacon to one of our popes, 2 popes ago, in fact, Pope Cyril, but in the Coptic language, it's Kyrillus. So Pope Cyril was very famous during his lifetime for miraculous features. And one day, my father's best friend, George, was standing next to the Pope, and the Pope was administering communion to the parish. And every now and again, someone would come and he, instead of administering communion to them, he would sort of whisper in their ear and sort of usher them away. And after a while, George said, "Pope, what are you doing, Your Grace?" And he said, "What do you mean? What am I doing? Don't you see?" And George said, "No, I don't see. What do you see?" And George had his hand, the Pope's hand, put over his eyes. And the Pope said, "Dear Lord, may he see." And George said that momentarily after that, he looked around the church and he could see everybody shining with the same light he imagined that the Transfiguration had displayed. Everyone was bursting with light, except for a few people whose light, it seemed, had been switched off. They weren't, for some reason, in church with their light switched on. And the Pope was telling those people, "Go away, turn your light on again, come back. You're not quite ready." And it just displays to us what the Transfiguration is about. We are beings of light, like Jesus. We don't see it right now because we see with our human eyes, but every now and again we may be lucky enough to see with our spiritual eyes. And icons is what I'm trying to get round to. Icons give us this opportunity to see the light inside people displayed in a kind of figurative, diagrammatic way. If you look at the halos, for instance, around everyone's head, those aren't just poetic crowns of glory. Those are what we as a church believe we would see if, seeing with our spiritual eyes, we would see everybody glowing with the light of the Holy Spirit from within them. And it's been seen so many times by many people lucky enough to see the miracle of it. But everybody is full of the Holy Spirit, full of light, just like Jesus. So imagine we could see with the eyes of God. If we saw that the way that the 3 disciples saw, and Pope Kyrillus saw on that occasion, and George saw on that occasion, what would it change in our actions towards our neighbors is what I'm trying to get to. What is this phenomenon that icons give us a window into? What does it give us in our lives? What could it possibly inspire in our lives towards our neighbors? I find that the answer is found in these verses. How can you say to your brother, Matthew says, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Number 2, why do we do this, and why didn't Jesus do this? Why wasn't Jesus seemingly judgmental in his lifetime? Jesus straightened up and asked her, and this is of course the woman who's going to be stoned for adultery, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. I'd like you to look at this icon. This is an icon, one of mine, admittedly, and it's of the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch by Philip. As Philip was going away, and he was suddenly brought to, or found himself in a place where an Ethiopian eunuch was passing by, and he was reading some of the holy book, and so it said that the Spirit ushered Philip towards the carriage to encourage him to talk about what he was reading. And of course, the eunuch said, "Well, I don't quite understand it. Can you explain it to me?" And after Philip explained, said, I think I should be baptized. I think I believe. Now, what I want to point out about this icon, because it demonstrates what I'm trying to get at, is seeing the world as God might see it. Of course, it's a very simple diagrammatic version of what I'm trying to get at, but it might exemplify it quite well if I just go through it. In the icon, if you'll notice, time is not an issue. And for the omniscient God, of course, time is not an issue. He sees past, present, and future all in a glimpse, and nothing matters. And if any of you are particularly interested in in stories about near-death experiences, and I'm very interested in them. One of the most common themes that people mention when they go and come back is it's impossible to explain to you how time is not a thing there. It's impossible to declare how time does not matter. There is no time. And so in an icon, we are very liberally using past, present, and future in a single image to try and give you the sense that actually we're not just giving you a single moment, a single historical moment, but we're trying to show you everything we understand about the relevance of that moment. The relevance of the Ethiopian eunuch being baptized relates to how he was on the road talking to Philip, which you can see on the right-hand side of the icon, relates to how he was traveling from the city to a city. So you can see the city in the background, even though most likely the horizon would have covered it. So we've got past, present, and future. The future here is in the divinization of Philip. You can see around his head, he has a halo. Now, in the Orthodox Church, we have a saying that when we're asked by many people, are you saved? Do you believe you're saved? And we say, yes, I have been saved. I am being saved, and I will be saved. And the meaning of that, of course, is Jesus has saved me, and he is constantly changing me. He's making me more and more like him every day. Therefore, I am being saved by being made more like him every day. And when it is time for his second coming, I will then also be saved. It is a constant salvation, as it were, even though Jesus achieved everything on the cross. And so the future of this icon is seeing Philip in his divinized form, as he will be in heaven. He is already full of the Holy Spirit, full of light, in the same way that the eunuch now has a ray of light descending upon him from heaven. And so we see past, present, and future in a single image. What you also see that maybe isn't immediately obvious is the complete lack of realistic perspective. Why? Because God, of course, sees from every perspective. He can see through us, inside us, around us, behind us, in front of us. And because of that omniscience, he has the ability to judge perfectly. And I think about this all the time whenever I really am angry with someone in my life, whether it be a friend or my wife or my kids. And it's mostly because I don't have the same sense of omniscience that God has. I can't see why they're acting like this. All I see is the action. And so I get angry at the action. Had I known the moment before they became angry, what they were feeling, how they had been hurt, what were their struggles, I might just be that bit less judgmental. I might be gracious. I might not condemn like Jesus. And so icons, in their attempt to help us see without past, present, and future meaning anything in particular, without the restriction of things hidden to us, and we see like God sees. The idea is that they encourage us to see that if you saw everything, you would know to forgive immediately. You would know never to judge your friend or your brother, because you couldn't possibly judge perfectly unless you saw and felt everything they felt, unless you knew their history. Sorry, I've forgotten to click on my my bullet points. I know, forgive me, I speak very, very quickly, and I try and cram way too much into one sentence. I'm a bit like St. Paul in that matter. I never give you a comma or a hyphen. So you'll have to just hold up your hand and say, slow down, because you're going way too fast. So like I said, I'll just go over these bullet points that I've written. By seeing the full picture of a person's life, past, present, and future, we can fully understand them. But of course, we don't usually with our human eyes. But when we do understand, then real empathy can happen, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. Putting someone else's shoes on for a moment and really, really trying to understand where they came from every time you get angry is an incredibly difficult thing. But if we were able to do it, then we would be just like Jesus. We would be continually becoming more like Jesus every day. And we'd have an appreciation of their struggles and their worth. Because if we saw the light emanating from everybody, we'd immediately realize, what am I doing? What am I saying? What am I doing to this person? This person is a child of God. This person is a heavenly being. This person is full of God's light. How dare I get angry at them? How dare I say what I just said or do what I just did? Calm down, Fadi. Calm down. This person is a child of God. I've got two icons on the screen because they also exemplify from two different traditions what I'm talking about. If you look on the left, the Annunciation icon we can see the angel Gabriel talking to Mary, but in the background, you see two buildings. And the interesting thing about these buildings, you might notice, is the impossible perspective that's being displayed here. The building on the left, we're almost looking at it from above. We can see things that we shouldn't necessarily see if we were low down. And yet the building on the right, we can see from below. And if these buildings are the same height and they're in the same location, that would be impossible. So the idea here is in the Greek tradition that the iconographer, again, is trying to give us the same view or the same omniscience as God would have. He would see everything from every different direction, from around the building, from below the building. And because of that, he has the perfect ability to judge, and we don't. If you look at the icon on the right, this is an icon of Saint Mina, the Egyptian saint of around the 3rd or 4th century, I think. And the funny thing about this is the timelessness of it. Because Mina, we see him deified or divinized. We have his halo around his head. So he has been resurrected. This is after he's passed and he's in paradise, shining with the light of resurrection. And yet behind him on the left of the icon is St. Mina's monastery in Egypt, which of course wasn't built until after his lifetime. So here we have the present of his presence in our icon. And yet we also have the future, which is the monastery built. And to his left also are two camels who, in the story of his biography, we know that when they took the body of St. Mina after he passed through the desert to try and find a suitable resting place for him to bury him, the camels both suddenly dropped and would not budge. And so the people who were taking his body said, well, this must be where God designated that we bury him. And that was also, of course, before the monastery was built and after Mina had been lost to us. And so here you have past, present, and future in a single image. Again, time not being an issue. So I'll talk a little bit about how do icons help us to love and worship God there. Because if you remember in the beginning of the talk, I said, in my simple, humble view, Christianity at its simplest core is to, as Jesus said, love God with all your heart, love thy neighbor as thyself, and to basically be made more and more like Jesus every day, and through it being saved daily. So how do icons help us to love and worship God? What I understand about this is that icons as an object and as a process of making them, the physical icon, it is in itself an appreciator, or almost like a praiser. It offers praise of all the things God has gifted us in this world. And we take them and we repurpose them by making them into an icon, and we give them back to him in service and worship. And that offering in and of itself is an act of worship. So I'm very blessed and I'm very privileged to say that I have this as a field of work, that I'm able to worship constantly just by the nature of what I do. So from the animal world, we take eggs, as someone rightly questioned. For anyone who's ever painted or gone on any kind of painting course, you'll know that, of course, paint is made of colored pigment and some kind of binder. And in the case of icons, especially in the Orthodox Church, we use egg. Mostly because it's one of the first materials ever used in painting historically. So we have plenty of examples that it can last for thousands of years if it's used rightly. So from the animal world, we use egg to make our paint. From the mineral world, we take the ground, we grind it, and we use it as our colored pigments, and we bind it with the egg. From the vegetable world, we cut down trees and we use the wood to paint on, and the cotton that we harvest to make our canvas. So we take from what God has given us, we repurpose in a kind of priestly way, and we give it back to him in an offering of service and of worship. And King David himself, one who praised God in his Psalms, and he said, "But who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand." And for those of you who love the singer-songwriter Matt Redman, he has a very beautiful song, "We have nothing to give but what first came from your hand." And I love that song. So that movement of offering what has been given to us by him for his service is a movement of worship. And that's how icons themselves are an aid for especially the iconographer and for anyone who participates in any icon course or as a hobbyist in worship. I mean, if we think about other ways that offerings can become worship, tithing, if it were monetary, financial tithing, we take what he has given, as in he is the real reason we have any of the work we do. He's given us the health in order to work. He's given us the brains in order to work. And so what he's given us, we offer back to him in worship and service. Charity, if we give of our time, again, we take what he has given of us, our health, our ability to give our time, even our time itself, and we offer it back to him and his people for the glory of his people. And if we look at what's been written in of course, the New Testament, therefore I urge you, says Paul, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I love that St. Paul mentions that just the action of keeping oneself sanctified for his service and to do the best as we can to keep our bodies sinless, that this is an act of worship, not just an act of contriteness, but an actual movement of offering towards him, and that in that it's a worship. And I just find that makes it a very beautiful, deep meaning of worship, rather than just the relatively shallow thing that even Matt Redman mentions in his song when he has the beautiful song, I'm coming back to the heart of worship. It's all about you. And I want to offer you more than a song, because a song in itself is not what you require. And it's true, he requires of us, all of us. So, and the icon itself, if I may go as far as to say, it is itself, the object, a metaphor for the incarnation of Jesus, the Word of God. Because when we think about, or when you've ever seen how the icon is made, the process itself is the making of a new thing where the divine and the human come together as one. It's a kind of a work together, or a working together of what God can do and I can do together to make something that becomes divine and human. To him I offer my hands, and I offer the wood that he gave me, and that's the human, that's the earthly. And to that I pray that he gives the Spirit of God into the icon, not so that it becomes more than a human offering really, but that it becomes an aid to someone's prayer life, an aid to inspiring them to be more like him, to enjoy him, to worship him. And to remind us that God so loved us that he would take on a flesh that would torment him, just so that in his new nature, that is his new nature of divine and human together, he could remake humanity and give us the divinity that had been lost in the fall of Adam. The icon in itself is a reminder of that, because it almost makes a new nature out of two things. So it's a reminder of what God did just out of pure love for us, that he would take flesh and dwell among us. So for this, we give thanks to God and worship for him for his great love and sacrifice. I hope you didn't get too too overwhelmed with how quickly I speak. I'm very sorry if that was too quickly. Forgive me.